In 1324, the richest man alive crossed the Sahara. His name was Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire. A realm so vast it swallowed deserts, cities, rivers, and trade routes whole. He traveled not with an army, but with spectacle. 60,000 attendants, 12,000 slaves, hundreds of camels carrying gold. When he entered Cairo, markets trembled. Gold flooded the economy so heavily that its value dropped for years. Think about that. One man destabilized a regional economy accidentally. Now pause. If generosity alone could bend a kingdom, what could intention do? What could strategy do? What could conquest do? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. In the 14th century, Africa was not weak. Europe was not supreme. A balance of power was not yet decided. And in another version of history, the Mediterranean might have become a Malian lake. The Mali Empire controlled the arteries of wealth. Gold from Bambouk, gold from Bure, gold flowing north across the Sahara to North Africa, then into Europe. At the time, Europe did not produce significant gold. It depended on African supply. European coinage, African gold. Cathedral funding, African gold. Trade expansion, African gold. The irony is staggering. Europe's future power was partially financed by African earth. Now imagine if that gold stopped flowing peacefully and began flowing strategically. Europe was not a unified machine. France and England were simmering towards what would explode into the 100 Years' War. The papacy was unstable. The Holy Roman Empire was politically fragmented. Italy was divided into jealous city-states. Iberia was split between Christian kingdoms and Muslim Granada. And Europe's population was about to be decimated by the Black Death. No NATO, no unified defense, no continental alliance, just rival kings watching each other suspiciously. If a foreign force struck strategically, Europe would not respond as one. It would hesitate, and hesitation kills empires. Critics always ask, but Mali had no navy. Correct, but navies can be built, especially with unlimited gold. Consider this. During his pilgrimage, Mansa Musa interacted with scholars, architects, engineers, and rulers across North Africa and the Middle East. In this alternate timeline, Musa returns to Timbuktu not only inspired by scholarship, but by power projection. He establishes a royal shipbuilding commission in coastal Senegambia, contracts with North African shipwrights, mercenary recruitment from Maghreb cavalry. Remember, Mediterranean powers were mercantile. If Venice or Genoa could profit, loyalty became flexible. Gold can convert neutrality into alliance. Gold can convert alliance into dominance. And Mali had more gold than anyone. Mansa Musa would not need to conquer all of Europe. He would need leverage. The most strategic target? Southern Iberia. Why Iberia? Because the Emirate of Granada, a last Muslim state in Spain, was under Christian pressure. If Mali intervenes on Granada's side, reinforces troops, funds fortifications, pays European mercenaries double, suddenly Christian expansion stalls. Imagine Malian cavalry landing in Al-Andalus, their armor glinting in Mediterranean sunlight. European chroniclers would struggle to describe what they were seeing. Not Moors, not Arabs, but sub-Saharan imperial forces backed by unimaginable wealth. The psychological effect alone would fracture morale. Year 1332, alternate timeline. A fleet assembled in North African ports crosses into the Strait of Gibraltar. Granada's banners rise. Malian gold pays Castilian defectors. A combined force marches north. Cavalry trained in Sahelian warfare adapts to Iberian terrain. European knights, accustomed to fighting each other, now face a coalition financed beyond their capacity to match. Sieges become expensive. And Mali can afford expensive. Castile cannot. Not for long. Within 5 years, southern Iberia becomes a Malian-backed protectorate, not annexed. Influenced, taxed, leveraged. In 1347, plague enters Europe. The Black Death begins dismantling society. Cities lose half their populations. Armies shrink. Trade collapses. Faith falters. Now imagine that during this devastation, rumors spread. African fleets control southern ports. African gold funds Grenada. The Desert Emperor expands. Europe would interpret plague as divine punishment. Clerical authority would be shaken, and fear of external conquest would multiply chaos. Some states might surrender territory to secure alliances. Others might implode. Mali would not need to conquer. It would need to outlast. Here we return to realism. Occupation across language, religion, and geography would be extremely difficult long-term. But coastal dominance? Possible. Economic leverage? Highly possible. If Mali controlled Gibraltar, key Iberian ports, trade taxation, it could regulate Mediterranean gold flow. European economies would become partially dependent on African stability. And that changes everything. The Renaissance begins in Italy partly because of trade wealth, stability, patronage. But what if Mediterranean trade routes were partially influenced by Malian taxation? Florence might still rise, but its funding sources shift. Intellectual exchange might deepen between Timbuktu and Italian scholars. Because here's what many forget. Timbuktu housed libraries, scholars, legal theorists, astronomers. If Mali projected power outward, intellectual prestige would follow. Europe might not see Africa as other. It might see Africa as rival. And rivals are respected differently than subjects. Fast forward to the 15th century. Portugal begins probing the West African coast. But in this timeline, Portugal already knows. West Africa is militarily organized, wealthy, capable of Mediterranean intervention. Exploration becomes cautious, diplomatic, perhaps negotiated. Instead of immediate exploitation, the Atlantic slave trade might not scale the same way, because initiating mass enslavement of a known imperial power is far riskier than targeting fragmented coastal states. If Mali establishes Mediterranean leverage in the 1300s, Ottoman expansion calculations shift. Iberian unification slows. Spanish imperial expansion delays. Portugal's African colonization becomes negotiation. The psychological arc of global dominance shifts. Europe no longer grows unchecked. Africa enters global power politics earlier, not as resource base, but as player. Because Mansa Musa chose legacy over conquest. He built mosques like Chinguarebe. He funded universities. He invested inward. And perhaps he understood something. Projection brings resistance. Expansion drains stability. Mali thrived because it consolidated. But history punishes isolation when rivals industrialize. And centuries later, Europe would return to Africa, not as trade partner, but as colonizer. History's cruel symmetry. Was Africa destined for colonization? No. Was Europe destined for dominance? No. The 14th century was fluid. The future was unwritten. A different strategic decision. A different military investment. A different geopolitical ambition. And textbooks today might speak of the Malian Mediterranean era. Children in Paris might study West African imperial doctrine. The Renaissance might be framed as a cross-continental exchange, not a purely European awakening. Power shapes narrative, and narrative shapes identity. In our timeline, the Gold King walked to Mecca and returned home. He built, he strengthened, he prospered, but he did not invade. And the Mediterranean remained European-dominated. But remember this, for a brief moment in the 14th century, the richest man alive was African. The strongest gold supply was African. The trade arteries ran through African lands. The balance was not fixed. It tipped. And it could have tipped the other way. History is not inevitable. It is chosen. And sometimes, the greatest revolutions are the ones that never happen.